as we speak, Palestinian gunmen are inside Israeli towns and cities.
Heavily armed militants going house to house.
Their attack as brutal as it was brazen.
It represents the biggest loss of life in a single day in Israeli history. And Israeli warplanes are now bombing the Gaza Strip.
Israel has made clear its mission now is to strangle the life out of Gaza, cutting off all food, water and electricity to its 2 million citizens.
The humanitarian situation in Gaza is beyond words. Nowhere and no one is safe.
The number of deaths from dehydration and malnutrition is rising as famine takes hold.
We must confront genocide. We must prevent it, and we must punish it.
The attacks by Palestinian armed groups on Israeli civilians in October 2023 were brutal crimes that rightly shocked the world. At the same time, it's important to know that these attacks and the subsequent Israeli war on Gaza were not the beginning of the crisis in Israel and Palestine. This crisis is rooted in Israel's decades-long illegal occupation of Palestinian land and its denial of the basic human rights of Palestinians. In 1947, the United Nations decided to divide the country that was then called British Mandatory Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. When Israel declared independence in 1948, it violently seized more land in Palestine than was outlined under the UN plan, and around 750,000 Palestinians were forced from their homes. Palestinians refer to this as the Nakba, or catastrophe. While one group of people gained a homeland, another group of people lost a homeland. Fast forward to 1967, when another war breaks out between Israel and its Arab neighbours, Egypt, Syria and Jordan. The war ends with Israel in control of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Palestinians living there now came under Israeli military rule. This was the start of what's known as the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory. Under international law, military occupations are meant to be temporary, but over half a century later, Israel still occupies Palestinian territory. It's also completely illegal for an occupying power like Israel to transfer its own population into territory it occupies. But that's exactly what Israel has done and continues to do in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. From the very start of its occupation, Israel began colonizing Palestinian land by building settlements. These illegal settlements are primarily residential communities built for Israelis to live in rather than the local Palestinian population on whose land they are built. The settlements also include agricultural and industrial developments. Today, around 700,000 Israeli settlers live in hundreds of settlements on Palestinian land. By building the settlements, Israel has literally cemented its grip over the West Bank. But it gets worse. Israeli settlements are central to a whole system of day-to-day oppression and discrimination against Palestinians. While Israeli settlers can travel freely throughout the West Bank, Palestinians face severe restrictions on their freedom of movement. And as Israel continues to build illegal settlements, it routinely demolishes Palestinian homes across the West Bank and East Jerusalem. It's a system of construction for Israelis and destruction for Palestinians. This discrimination against Palestinians is increasingly recognized by international human rights groups as an apartheid regime. Even before October 2023, Palestinians living in Gaza were already in crisis. In 2007, following a Hamas takeover of the Gaza Strip, Israel placed the territory under a land, sea and air blockade. The blockade severely restricted the movement of basic goods such as food and fuel into Gaza and made it extremely difficult for people to leave, even for medical treatment. Gaza became known as the largest open-air prison in the world, with unemployment and poverty rates soaring. Coupled with repeated cycles of violence between Israel and Hamas, the blockade devastated the economy and infrastructure of Gaza. The United Nations has described the blockade as a form of collective punishment against the population of Gaza. So, how has Israel got away with all this? 2 words: no consequences. The international community has done virtually nothing to stop Israel's colonisation of the West Bank or its blockade and bombardment of Gaza, despite its requirement to uphold international law. It's well known that the United States is Israel's closest ally and has a track record of not taking any effective action against Israel. But it's too easy to blame the United States. Other international powers, including the European Union and the UK, have done little to stop Israel from stealing Palestinian land and abusing the rights of Palestinians. The EU, for example, has come under intense criticism for continuing to allow trade with Israel, even though its trade agreement requires Israel to uphold international law and respect human rights. By failing to stop Israeli crimes, the international community has emboldened Israel to continue to break international law and to escalate its abuse of Palestinians. It's this culture of impunity that has allowed Israel to kill tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza, a potential genocide in full view of the world.
To attack civilians intentionally, residential buildings, to kill children, women, men, all civilians, in a very systematic way, if there is no accountability. How to maintain hope in the young generation's minds?
It's a military occupation that affects the Palestinians, and therefore the international community are not only entitled to intervene, they're obligated to intervene. Those countries that are also friends of Israel have an obligation to also be friends of the Palestinians and stop this blatantly illegal and immoral action that Israel is taking.
Decades of colonisation and apartheid, as well as the international community's failure to protect the rights of Palestinians, have fueled the flames of conflict. But change is possible. Across the globe, people are taking to the streets in support of peace and justice. Student protests are putting pressure on universities to cut ties with Israeli firms that are complicit in the occupation, while some states and investors have divested from Israeli companies because of their links to war crimes. Now, more than ever, people are demanding action from their governments. Action to tackle the root causes of the crisis in Palestine and Israel. Will you join us?